Are we on? Are we visible?
We are visible and we are recording. You can see the numbers starting to tick up. And I will go ahead and welcome all of you to another edition of Reader Meet Writer. I am your host, Wiley Cash. I am the writer in residence at UNC Asheville, and I'm also the 2019 recipient of the Pat Conroy Legacy Award from SIBA. SIBA stands for the Southern Independent Booksellers Alliance, and this is an organization that represents just under 700 independently owned bookstores throughout the Southeast. And perhaps one of those bookstores is the reason that you are here tonight to hear DENNY S. Bryce discuss her new novel. If that is the case, I encourage you to purchase Denny's book or any book that your heart desires from the independent bookstore that brought you to this event. They are the lifeblood of our literary communities, and they are more important than ever before, and we need to support them more than ever before. And one way you are supporting them is by attending this event, Reader Meet Writer. We've been doing these author events since July, and normally this is the kind of thing that Denny would be doing in a bookstore. But we can't do that because of COVID. So now we are doing the next best thing, which is bringing you live book events on your screen. So we are still talking about books. We're still taking your questions. We can still get you signed books if you reach out to the booksellers. And we are doing everything we can to make the experience as wonderful as we can. We have another great event coming next Thursday, April 8th. We'll be joined by Clay McLeod Chapman, author of the novel Whisper Down the Lane, which is inspired by the satanic panic of the 1980s. And being from a Southern Baptist church in Gastonia, North Carolina, I remember the satanic panic very well. So please join us next Thursday, April 8th, right here at 7 p.m. But tonight we are joined by DENNY S. Bryce for her new novel that just came out on May 30th, Wild Women and the Blues. And I want to say a few words about her before I turn the evening over to her. And I also want to encourage all of you, if you have questions about anything that Denny is talking about tonight, go to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type your question in, make sure to mention your name and the name of your home bookstore. And at the end of tonight's show, I will ask Denny your question. So don't hesitate. It doesn't interrupt the show. Please type in your question as soon as it pops into your head, and I will share it with her at the end of our show. DENNY S. Bryce is an award-winning author and 3-time RWA Golden Heart finalist, including twice for Wild Women and the Blues. In addition to writing for NPR Books and Frolic Media, the former professional dancer is a public relations professional who has spent over 2 decades running her own marketing and event management firm. A member of the Historical Novel Society, Women's Fictions Writers Association, and Novelists, Inc., she is a frequent speaker at author events. She's originally from Chicago, but she is now living in Georgia. DENNY S. Bryce, I will turn it over to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, first and foremost, thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you and the other booksellers and everybody who's in the audience about my book, Wild Women and the Blues. As Wiley mentioned, my book debuted March 30th, 2 days ago. Yes. And it's been quite the ride, a very exciting experience for a debut author. This is my first book, although I've been around the writing community for a decade. I've only got around to finally getting the right story together that allowed me to have it be published. And my publisher is Kensington Books, and my agent is Nalini Okolakar from Spencer Hill Associates. But first, I want to tell you a few things about Wild Women in the Blues. It is historical fiction. Although Wiley mentioned my association or my awards, if you will, with the Romance Writers of America, my story evolved over the years from a historical romance into historical fiction. And it's also told in a dual storyline, What I mean by that is that I have a 1925 storyline and a 2015 storyline. In the 1925 storyline, it is the story of an ambitious chorus girl. Her name is Honorée Dalcour, and both timelines are set in Chicago. In the 2015 storyline, my protagonist, if you will, is a young man by the name of Sawyer Hayes. Sawyer Hayes is grieving over a loss in his family and suffering through some levels of guilt in addition to grief. And he decides that he needs to accomplish something, one thing that will allow him to get his feet on the ground a little bit more evenly again. And that one thing is to finish his grad school thesis. He's a film major, so that means his film documentary. So he heads off to, after finding some things in his grandmother's attic, he decides that he needs to go visit the woman who's pictured in one of the photos that go back many, many years. And he learns that she's still alive. And he goes to Chicago, to Bronzeville from California, to meet Honorée Dalcour. Honorée Dalcour, who at this point in time is 110 years old. So the story works to share these two characters' place in the world and also how they come together. Some of the elements of the story that have been very much talked about, and I'm thrilled that people are excited about this element of the story, is the fact that in the jazz world of 1920s Chicago, it's a place that people haven't read that much about. If there are those stories set in that time period, so often about the Black community, it might be about Harlem, the Harlem Renaissance, for example. But Chicago had a Black Renaissance as well. It probably reached a peak, or that version of the Renaissance reached a peak in the 30s and 40s, but it was definitely building up momentum in the 1920s. And in the 1920s, the jazz music scene was vibrant. It was just a part of the city's, not only the city's sound, but the city's pulse. Everything about it was these series of nightclubs on the South Side and what they called the Black Belt, but also called Bronzeville. And my chorus girl main character in 1925, she wants to move from the seedy speakeasy that she works in to the Dreamland Cafe. Another, or I should say, an inspiration for me writing this particular story goes back to my maternal grandmother. My maternal grandmother arrived in this country in 1923, and from Montego Bay, Jamaica. And she arrived in New York, thought she was going to live her life in New York because she met my grandfather previously, he'd sent for her, and then she ended up in a small town in Ohio. But she was definitely someone who held on to memorabilia. There were just old photos, old pieces, everything there seemed, anytime I went to visit her, I felt like I was stepping back in time. And I was always asking her questions about her photographs and just all of these wonderful things that she had in the house that were essentially antiques by the time I was looking at them. But she would share some great stories. Another inspiration was, some of you may even recall that on Facebook, if you happen to be a Facebook user, there, a few years ago, there was a woman in a senior living facility who was visited by a young man who had a piece of film of her from when she was a dancer in the 1940s. And this was something that I think it was around 2015 when this particular, I think her last name was Alice. I want to say, I can't remember her last name right now, but nonetheless, I remember seeing this and it sort of churn the gears of that what if question that so often authors rely on to sort of kick them into that story mode. So I was like, that's very interesting. So what if? And then another inspiration for this story is really it's a fabulous experience for me. But at the time, I was a youngster in New York, a professional dancer, which meant I was waiting on tables most of the time. And so I was dancing during the day, waiting on tables during the evenings and on weekends. And I worked at a place called The Cookery. The Cookery was owned by a gentleman by the name of Barney Jacobson. This name may or may not be familiar, but he was the owner of Cafe Society, which is a historic night spot. I believe Billie Holiday sang there and did, I think she debuted one of her songs, and I can't remember the name of that right now, but nonetheless, he had a reputation as a fabulous place for Black entertainers. One of those entertainers from way back in the day was making a comeback in her 80s. Her name, Alberta Hunter. I was working at the Cookery, and on weekends when Alberta Hunter was working, I was assigned, if you will, I was assigned to bring her tea. So as I continued to do this little service for her before she broke into song and all these other things, we got to know each other because we shared a mutual love for the city of Chicago. And Alberta Hunter is one of the historical figures who actually makes an appearance in Wild Women in the Blues. And at the time when I met her, I certainly didn't understand or bother to do any research to know the significance of meeting a woman like her. She was a songwriter, a blues singer who had a fabulous career in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and also worked and wrote songs for Bessie Smith and others. So it was an incredible opportunity that I remember in hindsight, and I was like, wish I'd asked her some more questions, but actually I just ended up remembering later in life that, wow, I knew someone who I can actually put in the book. In addition to that, some of the other questions that I've received in other conversations I've had about Wild Women in the Blues talks about the atmosphere of the sounds that are somewhat really emphasize sound as important in the story. One of the things that I did as research, because research is critical to writing historical fiction, I was not around in the 1920s, I swear. And so I had to do a lot of digging around, reading, spent a lot of time at the Harold Washington Library in Chicago with archivists and librarians who were just fabulous, sharing their information and their understanding of how to search through their collections to gather that information that would be so important to helping give my story that authenticity and that atmosphere. And the sound, I feel that people comment about the feeling of being in that night spot, being in that nightclub, has to do with the fact that I listened to a lot of jazz music from that time period as I wrote. I'm a type of person, some people write in silence, I write with music. And the music gives me just some elements of atmosphere. It's all according to whatever kind of scene I'm writing, then I'm able to use that music and bring it. I feel strongly about trying to bring those sounds to a scene in some kind of way. So I spent a lot of time listening to that music from the time period, the blues singers, in particular, the female blues singers from that time period. And I was able to also pay close attention to the lyrics and the voices, how the pronunciation and emphasis and style of the voices of that time period. So that was another important element to bring to bear. I'm looking down at my notes to make sure I'm covering as much as possible. And I'm probably going to ask Wiley to come back in and ask me a few questions so I can keep the momentum going here. Hey, Wiley, how you doing?
Hello, I'm doing great. And we've got some questions that people have already joined in with, and I want to get to those in a moment. But so many things you said while you were talking, I was like, oh my gosh, I've got to remember to ask this. I've got to remember to ask this. I really want to know about this or that. So a couple that I want to ask about is, you know, you're balancing these two timelines. We have Sawyer and, you know, a contemporary, and then we have Honoré, who's both a contemporary with Sawyer, but we're also kind of looking back in her past. And given your interest in historical fiction, given the depth of your research, what was it like balancing those two timelines? And what were some of the challenges? You mentioned earlier about, you know, getting the book into the shape that it was finally in, where it got published. And was the challenge of balancing those two timelines part of that?
Well, one of the things that my editor pointed out early in the process, which I felt was just so critical, is that the two timelines, 2015, is nonetheless a point in time. And so often when you're doing what is called a dual timeline and you have a long ago element and a near term element, the near term element doesn't always have the same texture because sometimes authors don't treat that time like a historical time. So that was something that was important for me to hear from my editor so that I could dig in and treat 2015 like a historical time period. So that meant really understanding what were the headlines in 2015 Chicago, what were the key things that a young person traveling from one end of, because he was from California, but he was coming and trying to get to Paris and traveling all over the country at this point in time. What were those key factors that I had to keep in mind as a writer to make sure there was the same authenticity. I also spent so much time in Chicago in my 20 years, and many of those years I also worked at a few of the blues spots in the city as a waitress. Me and my waitress days, I'm going to have to write that book too. But so that gave me a feeling for the nightlife in Chicago during a certain time period, and some of that is also in the story. So yes, it's a challenge to balance and make sure you're giving as much to both time periods. But that input from my editor really helped me hone in.
That's so fascinating. You must have a great editor, and
her name is Essie Soga.
With the debut, getting advice like that with the debut novel and feeling like, oh my gosh, this person knows what they're doing. All right, let's do this. And I think it's so funny when not funny, but I think it's so interesting when books are marketed or cataloged as historical fiction, because sometimes I think, well, all fiction is historical, because if it's written yesterday, it's historical, right? I mean, we're constantly trying to.
Well, they actually technically claim that for something to be historical fiction, it has to have happened 50 years ago.
50 years ago.
So that's their cutoff. And as we get older, historical fiction gets closer.
Oh, no. Oh,
think of that. That there's that too. But I know in that we were talking about this very thing recently in another panel discussion I was having about where does that historical fiction fall in terms of categories, especially when you're talking about something like a dual timeline. But you also have subgenres. you have historical romance, you have historical fantasy, you have biographical historical fiction, and just all of these different categories, and many of them have different types of rules that you have to be aware of and conscious of, and that's fascinating as well, because I have historical figures in my book, but my main characters are fictional, you know, but I still have to adhere to rules of history that are not unmovable objects, if you will.
And we had a romance writer a few months ago named Kate Claiborne, and she was talking about how the more specific the genre gets, the more specific the rules of the genre get.
Yeah.
And the readers are so engaged, they're so dedicated, that there's the expectation that they know what to expect. I mean, they know the score.
Yes, and there are in Kate writes romance, contemporary romance, and there are in a romance, the reader is looking for a happy ever after. That is the scope of what that story needs to deliver. How the author gets the couple to that place is where the story is, the meat is, and that keeps the reader turning the page, because they're sitting there going, how are they going to make this work? Because there are so many obstacles, there's so much conflict, there's such different people, how are they really going to work it out? So it's very much character driven, I feel, in romances, and that really inspire the reader and the author to figure out, how are we going to make this work? In historical fiction, like you're really looking at, I look, and it happens in romance too, but I'm looking at themes. I'm looking at also telling untold stories. One of the things that is exciting about my work will focus on Black characters. They will be the protagonists. Their stories will be embedded in the history either of African Americans or of Black people outside of the United States, and their stories as well. So with that mission, if you will, of wanting to tell these untold stories, you're able to historical fiction doesn't always say you're going to have a happy ending. You want the reader to have a satisfying ending. You want them to feel that this is the story that I expect it to be told, because there are some expectations, just as you said. But you don't always have to have a romance wrap up perfectly, but sometimes it does. You have the option.
Well, let me ask you, since we're talking about some of this stuff, and especially Black characters and the importance of locking in on a time. Were there particular things you were thinking about connecting 2015 with Sawyer's Story and Jazz Age Chicago for Honore Story? So we're 1920s, 2015. We've got America's first Black president in 2015. Then we're also writing about 1920. And were you thinking thematically, culturally?
Thematically, in that regard, I think that what I wanted to emphasize was that this young man, his ambition, he was from a relatively well-to-do family. His father was a curator in a museum in Paris. He was a film student with at Berkeley, and so just his options, his opportunity, his place in the world was already in extreme contrast
Mhm.
to the ambitions of a young lady who wanted to be a chorus girl at a Dreamland Cafe. So that those differences right there, and he's focusing in on his grief and his inability to cope with that aspect of his life when these other trappings of life are already in place, in a way where you would expect a better success model, if you will. So those not contradictions, but those opposite worlds from that time to that period. I deliberately made this young man someone who had opportunities. He was definitely a middle income, college educated. He was in grad school, just all of those things that weren't as easily accessible at all in 1925.
Sure, and she's just trying to survive.
Yes.
And he's trying to, as he said, deal with his grief, but also settle his career and advance himself. And her dreams are a little smaller, perhaps.
In her world, her dreams were huge.
Sure, yeah.
And that again is part of the juxtapositioning of the two time periods, because one of the things that I've said about these characters, or the stories that I like to tell, are not that my characters will always right the world, but they will conquer the space that they live in. Because she's not trying to, Honoré is not trying to change the segregation or the fact that they had redlining and housing was impossible, and the African American community was limited in jobs and all of these other factors. What she's definitely living in a world that has all of these things happening around her and to her, but she's about her own version of ambition and success.
Yeah, and also the purity of her dreams as well is such a driver. We have a lot of questions and a lot of comments, so I need to stop yakking and let people who can't yak, they're just typing in the comments like, when's it going to get to me? I think we might have a mutual friend in Barbara Claypool White.
Yes.
The author.
Yes.
She says hello.
Oh, tell her hello.
Down here in North Carolina, so it's great to see her hop in. Becky asks, why do you think the use of dual timelines is so popular? Do you have any ideas about that?
I love dual timelines. I love reading them, and I just was inspired to write this one that way. I feel that one of the things they do is allow a means for readers to find the story more accessible, because especially if you use a near time, timeline or storyline and a long ago storyline, it's something that a reader can go in and say, I recognize this, and so I can connect to that, because that's what the author is doing with their plotting and with their characterization and with their themes. They're saying these two stories have similarities, even though there are huge gaps in time, that we are mirroring, if you will, but also maybe interpreting a little bit differently. And then you can also have secrets and mystery and some other things, plotty things that you can incorporate as well with those two timelines.
And there is a certain tingly sensation of reward whenever we see how the timelines converge.
Yes.
Thematically, plot. That's well said.
That's fun. That's fun for the writer, but joyful, hopefully satisfying for the reader. That's what you want to do as well.
Tracy asks, I love historical fiction. I've been waiting to read this book when I heard about it a couple of months ago. I just started reading it. It's beautifully crafted. It's atmospheric, and I'm going to lose a lot of sleep. And Tracy also asks, is there any way to get signed copies off the top of your head? Do you know any store that's selling them, or are you
I
partnering with
am
anybody?
doing book plates for different stores, so it's according to where she's located. And maybe someone can put that in a chat or something, and I can email her, because
Okay.
I'd love to get her. I have a whole bunch of signed book plates.
My advice to Tracy would be to reach out to your independent bookstore, or let us know where you're from, Tracy, in the chat, and I will shout that out. Lindsay says, this book reminded me of City of Girls by Elizabeth Gilbert, and the interview aspect of Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid, both in the best way. Are there any other books that are being compared to Wild Women and the Blues? So I'll ask you, Denny, who are your comps? If you were an independent bookstore bookseller, you would say, oh, if you loved blank, you'll love Wild Women and the Blues.
Actually, The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, I've heard so often, even though I hadn't read it. I'm reading it now and loving it to death. And then there's the similarity in covers, because on the cover of that book, the gal has a beautiful green dress on. And so my gal has a green dress on too. But I would say, oh, this is a hard one, because we were talking, a group of us were talking about this recently, because right now and over the next few years, you're going to see more and more stories, untold stories by Black authors in historical fiction. Some coming up, I'm just going to name drop real fast. Vanessa Riley, Island Queen. Piper Hughley has a couple coming out very soon. Kaya Alderson has one called Sisters in Arms. So what my point is, I'm going around in circles, is that it's a tough question to say what are those comps, because I know some of my favorite authors that do this kind of work with the dual storylines and the fictional characters in historical settings include Beatrice Williams, Kate Quinn's. The Alice Network has a dual storyline that's brilliant. Her new book, The Rose Code, has 3 different timelines that she brings together beautifully. I aspire to be in those categories. And I just think you'll see more and more of those. For the booksellers, Evelyn Hugo, even a little taste of the Alice Network, and City of Girls works. Those are a few.
It is sometimes challenging to have those comps, but that's what's so amazing about booksellers and independent bookstores. They're able to have somebody walk in off the street and put a book like yours into their hand if they mention one of these books. Julia says the Bookworm Bookstore in Powder Springs, Georgia, will have signed copies. This is our May Book Club special meeting. So if anybody wants signed copies, the Bookworm Bookstore in Powder Springs, Georgia.
Yes, it will.
And I bet they would be thrilled to ship to you. I'm looking back through some others. Ed, Prairie Lights out in Iowa City. He asks, do you think there is anything odd about historical fiction seems to be so popular at a time when historical illiteracy seems to also be so paramount in our society?
Again, a question that's interesting, because the topic of why is historical fiction, there are a lot of books out right now. There are a lot of stories that need to be told. I don't know about the connection to literacy or illiteracy. I'm not sure I'm understanding that question, that element of the question. But I feel that historical fiction is, you learn and you experience. And I think people are growing more and more curious about the world around them, as always, but also the past. How does the past connect to now? And if you think about 100 years ago, almost to the day, to the same time period, America, the world experienced a pandemic with what was called the Spanish flu, but that name was more so, just came about as not what it was. But that flu, that epidemic was as devastating, even more so, I'm sure, during the time, since they didn't have a vaccine that eventually came along for years and years, as where we are now. So it's like, does history repeat itself? What can I learn from history that might help me today, tomorrow, or down the road? And for those authors who are so skilled at shaping those themes and those stories, when you walk away, it leaves you thinking, that happened? Those people dealt with whatever a certain way. Is there something I can glean from that?
Sure. That's well said. I think he was asking specifically about maybe outside the reading community. I feel like readers, and Denny, my final question I'm going to ask you is about this wonderful community that you've built and fostered and taken part in, and are still thriving in. But the reading community, when I go out on the road or do events like this or meet people like you, they're always smart. They're always interesting. They're always culturally, politically, historically aware. But I think what the last question was about is so many people seem so unaware of history at the same moment that books like yours are blowing up, and it's such, and I guess it's just the difference between maybe readers and non-readers.
It could be, but there's also the opportunity to introduce more stories that are diverse, that have an appeal to a broader audience, and helping to change that I'm not a reader. Because it's sort of like, I'm sure people have heard that, or maybe they haven't, that young people, all people, like to see themselves in the stories that they either watch on television, the movies, or the books they read. So the opportunity for more people of color to be seen in a broader mediums more frequently than the caricatures, which had been so common for so long. I feel that perhaps we can do something, or we're building something that will change or lessen that gap between those who do and those who don't read. It could happen.
That's beautifully said. That is beautifully said, and I hope you're right, and I think you are. The last question I want to ask you as we close out, we might have some folks in the audience who are debut novelists who have a book about to come out. You've gotten so much attention and so much support. Do you have any words of advice for those folks who are looking to publish a book or are about to publish a book to take us out here?
Well, all I can talk about is what I've done. And one of the things that I did was to immerse myself in the publishing community. And by doing that, I'm a craft junkie. So I'm always trying to take a class, talk to somebody about how to do this thing that we call writing books. And that gets you out there. It's, for some people, you spend 20 years, 10 years, 5 years at home with your family, quietly off to the side, writing your books. But what can be so helpful is talking to other people who are in that same place about the process, about the feelings, the emotional ups and downs, ins and outs, and getting out there. Earlier, before we launched into this conversation, we were talking before, and I'm also an advocate of getting a website before your book comes out. Getting out there on social media, lurk for a while, see what the rhythm of this whole world is like, so that you can immerse or get into it a little bit more comfortably, because there are people out there. That's one of the things that I love about the writing community is generosity. For the most part, you are going to run into people who understand that it's okay when you can't find a word or whatever. People who are sharing a similar experience, and they can be best-selling authors for 20 years. And you can be a newbie walking. I've had that happen to me when I first started in this world, where there were people who were just like, I was like, oh my goodness, just being around them. But they're just people who keep writing. And that's a good thing to do, is to find a community, get out there, even if your community is just one other person. It'll grow.
Well, Denny, this has been a pleasure, and I really appreciate the discussion and all the wonderful things you covered tonight, and in a short amount of time. So I think everybody should go out, snatch up DENNY S. Bryce's new novel, Wild Women and the Blues. And I want to thank her so much for joining us. Please join us again next Thursday, April 8th. We'll be joined by Clay McLeod Chapman, author of the novel Whisper Down the Lane. Until then, I'm Wiley Cash, host of Reader Meet Writer, and we hope to see you next week. Thanks again.
Thank you.